The morning sun of June 3, 1942, cast long shadows across the flight deck of the aircraft carrier Akagi, as Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood in silent contemplation. His weathered hands gripped the rail of the bridge, knuckles white. With tension that betrayed none of the confidence, his stern expression projected to the crew below. Behind him, the largest naval armada Japan had ever assembled stretched across the Pacific horizon like a steel constellation for aircraft carriers, to battleships, 3 cruisers, and 11 destroyers, all moving in perfect formation toward what he believed would be their greatest triumph. Nagumo had built his reputation on precision and surprise. 6 months earlier, his carrier strike force had delivered the devastating blow to Pearl Harbor that brought America into the war. The memory of that December morning still burned bright. In his mind, the perfect coordination, the complete surprise, the enemy caught sleeping at their moorings. Now, as his fleet approached the tiny coral atoll of Midway, he expected history to repeat itself. The plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's masterpiece of naval strategy. While Nagumo's carriers would pulverize Midway's defenses, drawing out the remnants of the American Pacific Fleet, Yamamoto himself would lie in wait with the main battle fleet, ready to crush any American response. The Americans, still reeling from their losses at Pearl Harbor and the fall of the Philippines, would be forced into a desperate defense of their last Pacific stronghold. It was a trap wrapped in deception, and Nagumo was confident the Americans would walk straight into it. As referenced in the official Japanese Naval War College records, the operation had been planned with meticulous attention to detail, every contingency considered, every move calculated to achieve maximum surprise. Radio silence blanketed the fleet like a shroud, while false communications from Japanese bases suggested their forces were heading elsewhere entirely. The Americans, Nagumo reasoned, would be looking in all the wrong directions when death came calling from the northwest. Commander Minoru Genda, Nagumo's air operations officer, approached with the latest intelligence reports. The young officer's face bore the confident smile that had become characteristic of Japanese naval aviators, men who had swept across the Pacific with seemingly unstoppable force, sinking Allied warships from Hawaii to the Indian Ocean. Admiral Genda reported crisply, "All aircraft are prepared for tomorrow's assault. The pilots are eager to add Midway to their list of victories." Nagumo nodded, but something nagged at the edges of his consciousness. Intelligence suggested that Admiral Chester Nimitz had only 2 or 3 aircraft carriers left in the Pacific, and none of them were expected to be anywhere near Midway during the attack. Yet 6 months of war had taught him that Americans could be unpredictable in their desperation. Still, what could 2 carriers do against his 4? What could a handful of land-based aircraft on a tiny island accomplish against the most experienced carrier pilots in the world? The sun dipped lower toward the horizon, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson that reminded Nagumo of the rising sun flag that flew proudly above his flagship. Tomorrow would bring the decisive battle that would secure Japanese dominance in the Pacific. Once and for all, tomorrow would vindicate every sacrifice, every risk, every mile sailed across hostile waters under the cloak of secrecy. As darkness settled over the task force, Nagumo retired to his cabin, unaware that 300 miles to the northeast, American codebreakers had already stripped away every layer of his carefully constructed deception. The web of secrecy that was supposed to ensure his victory had instead become the very threads that would weave his destruction. Lieutenant Commander Joseph John Rockford hunched over his desk in the basement of the 14th Naval District headquarters in Pearl Harbor, his eyes bloodshot from hours of staring at intercepted Japanese radio transmissions. The cramped, windowless room that housed Station HYPO bore no resemblance to the Hollywood image of military intelligence. It was a cluttered maze of desks, filing cabinets, and IBM punch card machines, staffed by a motley collection of linguists, mathematicians, and cryptographers who had been working around the clock for weeks. The breakthrough had come on May 20th, when Rocheford's team finally cracked the Japanese naval code designated JN25. Like archaeologists uncovering an ancient tablet, They had painstakingly reconstructed the enemy's intentions, one fragment at a time. What they discovered sent shockwaves through the American command structure. The Japanese were planning a massive assault on a target designated AF in early June. Rockford was convinced that AF meant Midway, but convincing his superiors required more than intuition. The brilliant cryptographer devised an elegant trap. He arranged for Midway to transmit an uncoded message, reporting a breakdown in their fresh water distillation plant. Within hours, Japanese radio traffic reported that AF was short of fresh water. The deception confirmed what Rockford had suspected. Midway was about to become the focus of the largest naval battle in Pacific history. Admiral Chester William Nimitz received the intelligence with the calm demeanor that had made him one of America's most respected naval commanders. At 67, Nimitz had spent a lifetime preparing for moments like this. But even his steady nerves were tested by the magnitude of what Rochefort's codebreakers had revealed. The Japanese were committing virtually their entire combined fleet to the operation, of force so massive that it dwarfed anything the Americans could field in response. The numbers were sobering. Against Yamamoto's 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, 22 cruisers, and 65 destroyers, Nimitz could muster only 3 aircraft carriers, 8 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. On paper, it looked like a suicide mission. But Nimitz understood something that his Japanese opponents did not in naval warfare. The side that achieved surprise often overcame impossible odds, working with desperate efficiency. Nimitz began positioning his forces, the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, returning from the doomed Doolittle raid on Japan, were rushed back to Pearl Harbor for hasty repairs and resupply. The Yorktown, badly damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier, was patched up in a miraculous 72-hour repair job that would have normally taken months. Every available aircraft was gathered, every pilot briefed, every ship prepared for what might be the Pacific Fleet's last stand. As documented in official U.S. Navy battle reports, the American preparations took on an almost frantic quality as intelligence continued to pour in about the approaching Japanese armada. Unlike their enemies who expected to achieve complete surprise, the Americans knew they were walking into the fight of their lives. But they also knew something the Japanese did not: exactly when, where, and how their enemies planned to attack. On June 2nd, the American task forces slipped out of Pearl Harbor. Under cover of darkness, Rear Admiral Raymond Ames Spruance commanded Task Force 16 with the Enterprise and Hornet, while Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher led Task Force 17 with the hastily repaired Yorktown. Their orders were simple but daunting: find the Japanese fleet and destroy it before it could destroy Midway. As the American carriers disappeared into the vast expanse of the Pacific, Nimitz remained in his Pearl Harbor headquarters, monitoring radio traffic and weather reports with the intensity of a man who knew that the fate of the Pacific War hung in the balance. The Japanese still believed they held the element of surprise, still trusted in their elaborate deceptions and radio silence. They had no idea that their every move was being tracked by the very enemy they sought to ambush. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine whether Japanese expansion would continue unchecked or whether America would begin its long road back across the Pacific. In less than 48 hours, the ocean around Midway would become a graveyard for the dreams of empire. Dawn of June 4th, 1942, broke clear and calm over Midway Atoll. The small coral islands sitting like scattered pearls on the endless blue canvas of the Pacific. Colonel Harold Shannon, the Marine commander of Midway's defenses, stood on the observation tower of Eastern Island, binoculars pressed to his eyes as he scanned the northwestern horizon. Intelligence had warned him that this would be the day when Admiral Yamamoto's massive fleet would attempt to crush his tiny garrison and seize control of America's last strategic outpost. In the Central Pacific, Shannon's force was pitifully small for the task ahead. 6,000 Marines and Navy personnel manned the atoll's defenses, supported by whatever aircraft could be scraped together from across the Pacific. Ancient Brewster Buffalo fighters that were no match for Japanese Zeros sat alongside modern Dauntless dive bombers and Flying Fortress heavy bombers. It was a collection of whatever could fly and fight. manned by pilots who ranged from seasoned veterans to fresh-faced ensigns who had never seen combat. 300 miles to the northeast, Admiral Raymond Spruance paced the flag bridge of the Enterprise, his methodical mind working through the tactical problems ahead. At 55, Spruance was known throughout the Navy as a careful, analytical commander who never made hasty decisions, but today would test every principle he had learned in 3 decades of naval service. The intelligence from Pearl Harbor had given them the priceless gift of knowing where and when the Japanese would attack, but surprise alone would not be enough to overcome the massive disparity in forces. The American plan was audaciously simple in concept, but terrifyingly complex in execution. While the Japanese attacked Midway, believing the American carriers to be hundreds of miles away, Spruance and Fletcher would launch a coordinated strike against Nagumo's carriers. Everything depended on timing, navigation, and the courage of pilots who would be flying at the absolute limit of their aircraft's range with no room for error. At 0 for 30 hours, lookouts aboard the Japanese cruiser Tone launched their reconnaissance seaplanes into the pre-dawn darkness. One of these aircraft, piloted by Petty Officer First Class Amari, was assigned to search the sector where Task Force 16 lay hidden beneath the overcast sky. But mechanical problems delayed his launch by 30 crucial minutes, a seemingly minor malfunction that would have catastrophic consequences for the Imperial Navy. Meanwhile, aboard the Akagi, Admiral Nagumo reviewed the morning's attack plan with his staff. 108 aircraft, 36 Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Valdive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters would pummel Midway's defenses into submission, while keeping half his aircraft in reserve for any unexpected American naval response. It was a conservative approach, reflecting Nagumo's cautious nature, but one that left him vulnerable to the very kind of surprise attack he thought impossible. As the sun climbed higher, painting the ocean in brilliant shades of gold and azure, both fleets moved inexorably toward their appointment with destiny. The Japanese maintained their confident advance, radio discipline perfect, formations precise, every man convinced that they were about to deliver another crushing blow to American morale. The Americans, by contrast, sailed in tense anticipation, knowing that within hours they would either achieve one of the greatest victories in naval history or face annihilation at the hands of a superior enemy force. At 0530 hours, a Midway-based Catalina flying boat piloted by Ensign Jack Reed spotted the first elements of the Japanese fleet. His electrifying radio message crackled across the Pacific. Many planes heading Midway, bearing 3-0, distance 150. The battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War was about to begin. The die was cast. In the crystalline morning air above the world's largest ocean, hundreds of aircraft were preparing to take off from carrier decks, their pilots checking instruments and weapons one final time. Some would return as heroes, others would disappear, forever beneath the waves. But all of them, American and Japanese alike, were about to participate in a battle that would be remembered as the turning point of the Pacific War, the moment when Japan's dream of empire began its irreversible slide toward defeat. At 0600 hours on June 4th, the first wave of Japanese aircraft lifted off from Admiral Nagumo's carriers, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that echoed across the calm Pacific waters. Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, leading the strike against Midway, felt the familiar surge of confidence that had carried Japanese naval aviation to victory after victory across the Pacific. Behind him, 108 of the finest pilots in the Imperial Navy climbed steadily toward their cruising altitude, their aircraft gleaming in the morning sun like deadly silver birds. The formation was perfect, a textbook example of the precision that had made Japanese naval aviation the terror of the Pacific. Kate torpedo bombers, loaded with armor-piercing bombs instead of their usual torpedoes, flew in tight V formations while Valdive bombers maintained their positions with mathematical precision. Above them, Zero fighters weaved protective patterns, their pilots scanning the sky for any sign of American interceptors. On Midway, radar operators watched in fascination and growing dread as the approaching enemy formation appeared on their primitive screens like a swarm of angry insects. The alarm klaxons began their urgent wail at 05:55 hours, sending Marines scrambling to their battle stations and pilots racing toward their aircraft. Colonel Shannon knew that his obsolete Brewster Buffalo fighters stood little chance against the legendary Zeros, but they were all he had to throw against the approaching storm. 26 American fighters managed to get airborne before the Japanese attack arrived, their pilots pushing their overloaded aircraft to maximum climb rate in a desperate attempt to gain altitude advantage. Major Floyd Parks, leading Marine Fighting Squadron to 21, keyed his radio as he spotted the massive enemy formation approaching from the northwest. Tally-ho! Large enemy formation bearing to 70, Angels 12,000. Here they come, boys. The air battle that erupted over Midway was brief, savage, and utterly one-sided. The veteran Japanese pilots, flying superior aircraft, tore through the American defensive formation like wolves among sheep. Buffalo fighters, already obsolete when the war began, proved helplessly outclassed by the nimble Zeros. Within minutes, 15 American fighters had been shot down, their burning wreckage scattered across the coral islands below. But the sacrifice of the Marine pilots was not in vain. By forcing the Japanese to fight their way through the defensive screen, they disrupted the enemy formation and gave the anti-aircraft gunners precious seconds to prepare. As Tomonaga's bombers swept in over Eastern Island at 06:30 hours, they met a storm of defensive fire unlike anything they had encountered since Pearl Harbor. Every Marine on the ground who could hold a rifle was firing at the low-flying enemy aircraft. Machine guns, mounted wherever they could find stable platforms, poured streams of tracers into the sky. The new 40mm Bofors guns, recently arrived from the States, proved devastatingly effective against the Japanese dive bombers. As they pulled out of their attack runs, the Japanese bombing was accurate and destructive, but not decisive. Hangars erupted in flames, fuel tanks exploded in towering pillars of black smoke, and the power plant took several direct hits. Yet the runways remained operational, and more importantly, most of the American aircraft had been dispersed to revetments, where they survived the initial assault. As documented in Marine Corps' historical records, the defenders' preparation and stubborn resistance prevented the complete destruction that Nagumo had hoped to achieve. Lieutenant Tomonaga, his own aircraft damaged by anti-aircraft fire, circled the burning atoll and made a crucial decision, keying his radio. He transmitted the message that would seal his fleet's fate. There is need for a second attack. The words crackled across the airwaves to Admiral Nagumo, who received them with growing concern. Intelligence had suggested that Midway would be lightly defended, easily overwhelmed by a single strike. The fierce resistance his pilots had encountered suggested otherwise. As the first wave of Japanese aircraft began their return flight to the carriers, black smoke continued to rise from Midway's burning facilities. But beneath that smoke, American pilots were already preparing for their own strike against the enemy fleet. Marine Captain Richard Fleming, his dauntless dive bomber somehow having survived the Japanese attack, began plotting an intercept course toward the enemy carriers. He and his fellow Marines were about to prove that Midway's defenders had more fight left in them than Admiral Nagumo could possibly imagine. The stage was set for the morning's most crucial decision, one that would determine whether Japan's Pacific Empire would continue its expansion or begin its catastrophic collapse. Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the Akagi, his weathered face reflecting the internal struggle that would determine the fate of his fleet and ultimately the Pacific War. The morning of June 4th had not unfolded according to plan. Lieutenant Tomonaga's request for a second strike against Midway meant that the American defenses were stronger than intelligence had suggested, while his own losses, 11 aircraft shot down over the atoll, were higher than anticipated. The decision facing Nagumo was the kind that haunted naval commanders in their darkest hours. His remaining aircraft were armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against American warships, weapons perfectly suited for the naval battle he had been expecting. But Tomonaga's assessment suggested that Midway needed to be hit again before the invasion force could safely approach the atoll. Changing the armament meant time, precious time. during which his fleet would be vulnerable. Commander Minoru Genda, still recovering from appendicitis, but refusing to miss the most important battle of his career, urged caution. "Admiral," he said quietly, "we should maintain the torpedo armament until we know the location of the American carriers." But other staff officers argued that Midway had to be neutralized first. The debate grew heated as minutes ticked by, each second bringing them closer to a decision point from which there would be no return. At 07:15 hours, Nagumo made the choice that would echo through history: prepare the second wave for another attack on Midway. He ordered, replace the torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs with land attack ordnance. The command sent hundreds of sailors scurrying across the hangar decks of four aircraft carriers, wheeling heavy weapons back to storage areas and bringing up high-explosive bombs and incendiary rounds. The rearming process was complex and dangerous. Under the best of circumstances, torpedoes weighing nearly 2,000 pounds each had to be carefully removed from aircraft bellies and replaced with smaller but more numerous bombs. Fuel lines snaked across hangar decks as aircraft were topped off for the second mission. Ammunition boxes were stacked near aircraft, ready for quick loading once the rearming was complete. Unknown to Nagumo, his decision had placed his fleet in the most vulnerable position possible. The hangar decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu were now cluttered with aviation fuel, high explosives, and armed aircraft, a perfect recipe for catastrophe if anything went wrong. More critically, the rearming process would take at least an hour to complete, during which his carriers could not launch aircraft to defend themselves. At 07:28 hours, the reconnaissance seaplane from the cruiser Tone finally reported what Nagumo had been dreading: 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance to for 0 miles from Midway. The message sent shockwaves through the Akagi's bridge. American warships were much closer than anyone had believed possible. But the report was incomplete and confusing. Were these warships cruisers and destroyers, or did they include the aircraft carriers that posed the greatest threat to his force? Nagumo immediately radioed back, demanding clarification, ascertain ship types, and maintain contact. The response took another agonizing 27 minutes to arrive. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. The news hit Nagumo like a physical blow. Not only were American naval forces within striking distance of his fleet, but they included at least one aircraft carrier, exactly the kind of threat he had been trying to avoid. The American carriers should have been hundreds of miles away, completely unaware of his approach. Instead, they were perfectly positioned to launch a strike against his rearming aircraft. As described in Japanese Naval War College post-battle analysis, the next few minutes represented the most crucial decision point in the Pacific War. Nagumo faced an impossible choice: continue rearming his aircraft for the second Midway strike, leaving his fleet defensively naked, or immediately launch whatever aircraft he could with their current armament, sacrificing the Midway attack to deal with the unexpected American threat. The Admiral's staff erupted in heated debate. Some officers urged an immediate launch against the American fleet, arguing that carriers represented a far greater threat than Midway's remaining defenses. Others insisted that the Midway strike had to proceed as planned, pointing out that half the aircraft were already rearmed and that changing course again would create even more dangerous confusion on the hangar decks. As Nagumo wrestled with his decision, American dive bombers were already warming up their engines on the distant carriers Enterprise and Yorktown. The element of surprise that Japan had counted on had not only been lost, it had been turned completely against them. The hunters had become the hunted, and they didn't even know it yet. The stage was set for one of the most decisive moments in naval history, when split-second decisions made under impossible pressure would determine the fate of empires. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped the controls of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber as he led 37 aircraft from the Enterprise into the crystalline morning sky above the Pacific. At 38, McCluskey was old for a carrier pilot, but his steady hand and tactical brilliance had made him one of the most respected squadron commanders in the Navy. Today, he carried the hopes of the American Pacific Fleet in the bomb bay of his SBD-3 Dauntless. The launch from Task Force 16 had been a masterpiece of coordination despite the desperate circumstances. Admiral Spruance, gambling everything on a single massive strike, had ordered every available aircraft into the air. Torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters. 116 aircraft in total now flew toward their rendezvous with Admiral Nagumo's unsuspecting carriers. But the American attack was already falling apart. Navigation errors and communication failures had scattered the strike groups across hundreds of square miles of empty ocean. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, had become separated from their fighter escort and was approaching the Japanese fleet alone. Waldron, part Sioux Indian and one of the most aggressive pilots in the Navy, knew his obsolete Devastator torpedo bombers stood little chance against the Japanese combat air patrol, but he pressed on regardless. At 0920 hours, Waldron spotted the distinctive pagoda masts of Japanese warships on the horizon. Attack immediately, he radioed to his 14 remaining aircraft. The Devastators began their low-level approach, skimming just 50 feet above the wave tops as they headed directly toward the center of the Japanese formation. They were flying into what would become known as the most heroic and tragic attack in American naval aviation history. Admiral Nagumo watched from the Akagi's bridge as the American torpedo bombers appeared on the horizon like a line of sitting ducks. His carriers were still in the midst of rearming, their hangar decks cluttered with fuel hoses and ordnance. But his combat air patrol of Zero fighters was perfectly positioned to intercept the incoming threat. All fighters attacked the torpedo bombers, came the order from the Air Control Center. What followed was a massacre. The Zeros, among the most maneuverable fighters in the world, tore through Waldron's formation with devastating effectiveness. One by one, the lumbering Devastators fell burning into the sea. Waldron himself was among the first to die, his aircraft disintegrating under the concentrated fire of 3 Zeros. Within minutes, 14 of the 15 torpedo bombers had been shot down, their crews lost in the dark waters of the Pacific. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket among the wreckage of his squadron and watching the battle unfold around him. From his position in the water, he had a front-row seat to what would become the most crucial 30 minutes of the Pacific War. The Japanese Combat Air Patrol, having successfully destroyed Torpedo 8, was now flying at low altitude, their ammunition depleted and their fuel running low. The carrier's flight decks were spotted, with aircraft being prepared for the second Midway strike, while others from the first wave were landing and being refueled. It was at this precise moment of maximum vulnerability that Wade McCluskey appeared. Overhead like an avenging angel. MCCLU Sky had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over an hour, his fuel gauges showing dangerously low levels. Just as he was about to turn back toward the Enterprise, he spotted the wake of a Japanese destroyer heading northeast at high speed. Following his instincts, he traced the destroyer's course and found what he was looking for aircraft carriers steaming in formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft and fuel lines. Attack! Attack! McCluskey radioed to his dive bomber squadrons. At 10:22 hours, the American Dauntless aircraft rolled into their 70-degree dives, their pilots pushing their aircraft to the edge of structural failure as they plummeted toward the Japanese carriers. The morning sun glinted off their wings as they fell from the sky like metallic meteors. Each pilot focused on the single target that could change the course of the war. As referenced in official U.S. Navy after-action reports, what happened in the next 4 minutes would be remembered as the most decisive moment of the Pacific War. The Japanese carriers, caught completely off guard by the vertical attack, had no time to take evasive action or launch additional fighters. Their fate now rested in the hands of American pilots, who were diving through a storm of anti-aircraft fire toward targets that would make or break their nation's hopes in the Pacific. The bombs began to fall. The first bomb struck the Akagi at exactly 10:26 hours, June 4, 1942. Lieutenant Richard Best's 1,000-pound explosive penetrated the flight deck just aft of the midships elevator, detonating among the refueling aircraft in the hangar deck below. The explosion that followed seemed to tear a hole in the very fabric of the morning as aviation fuel and armed ordnance created a chain reaction of destruction that would consume Japan's flagship carrier. Admiral Nagumo felt the deck buck beneath his feet as his proud flagship began her death agony. The bridge windows shattered from the concussion, and acrid black smoke began pouring up from the hangar deck. "Damage report," he shouted. But his damage control officers were already fighting for their lives in the burning compartments below. The Akagi, veteran of Pearl Harbor and the rampage across the Pacific, had become a floating inferno in less than 60 seconds, 2 miles away. The carrier Kaga suffered an even more catastrophic fate, for bombs struck her flight deck in rapid succession, turning the massive ship into a blazing pyre that could be seen for 50 miles. The explosions were so violent that they hurled aircraft and pieces of the flight deck hundreds of feet into the air. Captain Jisaku Okada, the ship's commanding officer, stood calmly on his bridge as flames roared around him, accepting his fate with the stoic dignity of a samurai warrior. The Soryu, Admiral Yamaguchi's flagship, took 3 direct hits that sealed her doom within minutes. The veteran carrier, which had participated in every major Japanese naval victory of the war, settled lower in the water as her crew fought desperately to contain fires that seemed to feed on the very air itself. Her aircraft, loaded with fuel and bombs for the canceled Midway strike, became instruments of her own destruction. Only the Hiryu, positioned several miles northwest of her sister ships, escaped the initial American dive bombing attack. Rear Admiral Tamon Yamaguchi, known throughout the Imperial Navy for his aggressive leadership and tactical brilliance, immediately launched every available aircraft in a desperate counterattack against the American carriers. "We will show them the spirit of the Japanese Navy," he declared as his pilots prepared for what they knew would likely be a one-way mission. The Japanese strike found the Yorktown first, her distinctive island structure making her an unmistakable target, despite the valiant efforts of her combat air patrol and anti-aircraft gunners. 3 bombs struck the American carrier, causing severe damage and bringing her to a dead stop in the water. For a brief moment, it appeared that Admiral Yamaguchi's counterattack might salvage something from the morning's disaster, but the respite was temporary. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, dive bombers from the Enterprise and Yorktown found the Hiryu and subjected her to the same treatment her sister ships had received. For direct hits turned Japan's last remaining carrier into another burning wreck. Her flight deck twisted into unrecognizable metal sculpture by the force of internal explosions. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the full magnitude of the disaster became apparent to the surviving Japanese commanders. For fleet carriers, the heart of Admiral Nagumo's strike force were burning wrecks, or already beneath the waves. With them went over 300 of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, irreplaceable pilots who had formed the backbone of Japanese naval aviation since the war's beginning. The human cost was staggering. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors died in the sinking carriers, including many who had been heroes of Pearl Harbor just 6 months earlier. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto chose to go down with the Soryu, last seen standing at attention on his bridge as the flames closed around him. Admiral Yamaguchi made the same choice aboard the Hiryu, radioing his final message to Admiral Yamamoto: "I am going down with the Hiryu for the Americans." Victory came at a surprisingly light cost. The Yorktown, though severely damaged, remained afloat and was taken under tow. American aircraft losses totaled 35 planes with their crews, a fraction of what had been expected against such a formidable enemy force. The impossible had been achieved. A smaller, supposedly inferior American fleet had inflicted one of the most decisive defeats in naval history. That as darkness fell over the Pacific on June 4th, Admiral Yamamoto faced the bitter reality that his carefully planned operation had not only failed, but had destroyed the offensive capability of the Imperial Navy. The combined fleet, which had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier, was now in full retreat toward Japan, leaving behind the burning wrecks of its finest ships and the shattered dreams of Pacific conquest. The Battle of Midway was over. Japan's fleet had indeed counted on secrecy, but Midway had shattered every false hope. turning hunters into hunted and transforming what should have been the Empire's greatest triumph into the beginning of its inevitable end. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned forever, and the long road back to Tokyo Bay had begun.